You actually had another 7 or 8 minutes, so that's great. Thank you. That gives us an opportunity for questions, but I'm sort of going to exercise the moderator privilege here and begin with one question myself. But it's interesting to note that the Taiwanese model, as our speakers have pointed out, was based on exports and really trying to earn currencies for the country. And I most often ask, are these Raulista reforms going to help the economic development of Cuba? And it's very hard to see how repairing umbrellas and pruning palm trees and refilling cigarette lighters, which are some of the permitted activities right now, contribute to export and with meaningful in terms of economic development. But I wanted to ask Dr. Shuang something that caught my attention, that you had growth with equity, that the income distribution expanded, and one of the major critics of capitalism is that it exacerbates income inequality. What were the government policies that allowed this to happen?
You want me to answer right now? Okay. Okay. First, that's always good questions for the economic development. First, regarding about the exports, okay, as I mentioned, that opening trade is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the economic takeoff. And for a small country like Taiwan with limited resources, it is important, as I mentioned, it's the size. Our participants, our presenters just mentioned, Professor Tong mentioned about the size, because our size is limited by nature, right? So we have to rely on the external markets. So by opening up, which means that we will extend the markets in the sense of Adam Smith, right? The division of the labor is limited by the extent of the market. So the size of the market is very important to determine the degree of division of labor, or the so-called specialization, okay, to improve efficiency. So by opening up trade, then we can get access to international markets. But how to sell what kind of products? First, at the very beginning, right? And of course, according to the principle of competitive advantage, you should sell those products which you have the competitive advantage, means that which you have lowest opportunity cost in producing this, compare with the rest of the economy in the world, right? So in that sense, then for Taiwan at the very beginning, we export by the agricultural products, the so-called agricultural processed products. First, like canned pineapples, like asparagus, used to be our exports, our major exports, okay, and a major producer in the world. Okay, to start with the industry that has the competitive advantage. But the most importantly is try to shift and upgrade your technology by producing some more new goods that you cannot produce before. How? Okay, so next questions, then to avoid the economy being locked in the so-called traditional competitive advantage by producing goods that you have the competitive advantage to begin with, right? But you cannot just lock into that type of products. You have to think about how to change the production capabilities over time. Okay, and by exporting, then you get access to the international markets. You also get access to international knowledge and technology. And more important, to build up your domestic human capital. It's very important, because human capital means the quality of people, quality of workers. Okay, unless you have a good quality of worker, then even you import with the most state-of-the-art technology, you still cannot use it and apply it, right? So the accumulation of the human capital along the development process is very important, and also together with the technology transfer through the so-called foreign direct investment. That's also another channel. Okay, so these all together then enable you to learn new technology and apply this to your domestic productions. Therefore, you can constantly change your production spectrums towards some more new goods. That's my first answer to the first questions.
I had a question for Diego. Diego had a question.
Dr. Chuan, you mentioned that the greatest economic growth was occurred under Chiang Kai-shek. And conversely, in the last 15 years or so, under a more liberalized system, growth has slowed and unemployment has grown up. Can you explain why? And to Dr. Salazar, why do you think it's better to have foreign aid rather than direct private investment in the future?
Okay. Okay. Maybe I will reply to your second question later regarding about growth with equities. That's also very important. Okay. Regarding about the growth especially the slowdown. You mean the slowdown of the economy for the last 15 years after the so-called more free economy. I think that has to do with also we are a small open economy. Okay, openness, as I mentioned, openness is important, but there's also some shortcomings by by opening the trade, because now we are more influenced by the external shocks from abroad, especially financial crisis, especially the economic slowdown in the global markets that hits our economy. Okay, and more importantly is that we did not actually upgrade our service sectors. Okay, and as you can see that our service sector occupies about 70% of our GDP, but however, our employment share in service sectors only about slightly less than 60%. Which means there is a 10% gaps between the output share and the employment share of service sectors. In an advanced economy, usually the share of service sector is roughly the same, somewhere around 70% or 2/3 of the economies. Okay, so which means that there's a lot of rooms to create. Okay, in the service sectors, especially the so-called modern service sectors, in terms of education, healthcare. Okay. And also the so-called recreation and leisure industries. So those are the so-called modern service sectors that we can develop, and that will provide a large opportunity for the jobs creations. Okay, so that's the problems that we encounter, which is the so-called the effect of globalization. Okay, and that we suffer from that also. And as I mentioned, that the last decade of our economic liberalization, especially after the year 2000, is that we closed our economic type, especially the so-called restricted trade policy of the government against the mainland China, which is our largest trading partners. Okay, so again, I believe that has to do with our economic slowdown since the year 2000. And regarding about the aids and also the private investments, okay, I should say that U.S. aids play a very important role in Taiwan, but as you can see, that it's still debatable whether foreign aids actually helps the economy or not. You can find a good example, but you can also find some bad and counter examples, right? But however, in the case of Taiwan, we did receive the U.S. aid, okay, around the late 50 to the 1965, okay, and every year we received roughly about 100 million U.S. dollars per year, okay, during the period, okay. But the size is not so important. The important, of course, it's important in the sense that it helps the accumulation of capitals in the early stage. But the very important is that the U.S. aids at that moment, it actually the U.S. the representative actually told the leaders Chiang Kai-shek about how to use the aid. Okay, the aid is completed, okay, in accordance with how the Chiang Kai-shek used the aid. And it recommends that they should shift the purpose from military buildings toward economic development. And that guideline is very important for the earlier reform, economic reform for the Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, and the idea is, from Chiang Kai-shek's perspective, is to improve people's living in Taiwan, to develop Taiwan as a showcase for China. If we want to return to China, but at the moment it's not possible, maybe the alternative is to try to develop Taiwan as a showcase for China. And that's why we shift the resources from military buildings towards domestic development. And the USA played this critical role in that direction. Okay.
Jorge, you want part of it?
To illustrate what we can do, I'm going to go again to the past and tell you a little story about when I was in Washington, D.C. And the Cubans in Washington, D.C. were always telling all that we had accomplished in the past and how we had gotten so much in so little time. And there was a Britisher that continuously doubted. He said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Why? Why do you think you're so important and so different? So why do you think you have done a great job on everything you have done? Why do you think Cuba is such?" I mean, kind of mocking us, ridiculing Cuba. You know, you're a little island. And one of us finally decided to tell him, well, that is the ultimate destination of those countries that are relatively big islands closer to even larger continents. And the Britisher had to say, "So true, so true." So I feel that Cuba has been destroyed completely. First, morally. For me, that's the worst. Second, ecologically. Third, the economy is in ruins. Remember what I just told you. 5% of Cuban GDP in 1959 through a comparison across time, more or less, is what we think that we have lost in gross domestic product. The island is completely destroyed in every possible sense that you can imagine. We need a lot of foreign aid. We need something like, for example, Taiwan. Look at Taiwan, $100 million a year. That's equivalent at today's prices at $1 billion a year. Okay? That's only the US component. Now, of course, the Europeans have to come in and contribute as well. They have depredated, they have really participated in all of the destruction of Cuba. That's what the Europeans have done, being frank about it. So they'll have to come in and put down some money for the reconstruction of Cuba. Cuba has been completely destroyed economically, and I think we cannot do it on our own. We need so much capital at the beginning to reconstruct the island. I've just finished a little essay that hopefully will be published. I think the title we're giving it, it's really something that was put together by an old friend who unfortunately passed away, architect Nicolas Quintana, and we're publishing at FIU, trying to get it together. It's gonna be called The Reconstruction of Cuba, and it goes from all of the infrastructure onwards. We need a lot of resources in order to get back to the possibility of beginning to produce in Cuba at a certain basic level. And I feel in order to avoid inflation in Cuba, in order to import a lot of goods from abroad that we will need to, in that process of reconstruction, we need to have a capital inflows. And those capital inflows will have to be in terms of aid, so we won't have to repay them. And therefore, we will need a lot of foreign exchange in our reserves to be able to import much more than what we can export at the beginning, like Taiwan did at the beginning, like Korea, South Korea did at the beginning. This happened all over the Asia Pacific after the end of the war. And I believe it will be probably 5-6 years before we can begin to have a level of private investment in the country that will make it unnecessary to continue to have that level of aid. For the beginning, it's really essential.
I see a lot of hands, so I'm going to ask both the questions and the answers to be quite short. Dr. Shishlik.
This is a question of Professor Tong. In your argument, you say that economic changes should happen first and political changes should wait for later. and this is a two-part question. Why would you feel that a leadership can decide what is best for the country and for the people? The leadership in Cuba is not opening Cuba up to the market. They're not creating open society. They're doing gradual economic changes, particularly to remain in power. So the first part of the question is, if you accept the view, and there is a discussion in Miami about this subject, the view that an elite can dictate to the majority of the people how change should occur and what type of change. And the second part of the question is, well, how long does it take for the political and human rights changes to come after the economic changes? Are you saying to the Cuban people that they should wait with a dictatorship for another 30, 40, 50 years until there is a political and human rights change?
Yeah. Thanks for your questions. And I think, well, I think there's probably two dimensions to this question. The first one is there's a moral connotations from, I guess, from the question you're asking, because, well, I'm not telling the Cuban people to wait. But the problem is...
There is a discussion here in Miami.
I know, right.
Some people advocate, let's wait, let's make a few changes, political change will come later. So there is an argument in Miami.
That's right.
You brought it up, so...
Right, sure. So my argument is more about, like, well, morally, it might be wrong to say that, but the problem is, it's probably more practical to do that. Since, as you mentioned, well, now you have this dictatorship in power, and how could you remove it? Well, unless you are more powerful than the dictatorship, otherwise, what can you do? Right? You can just throw the moral arguments to depose them. So, I think that the question is, in terms of Cuba, it's very specific about Cuba. So the question is, if Cuba is also facing the economic hardship, and the economic development or conditions has affected its regime survival, and in that particular situation or scenario, you might be able to expect dictators to start doing something different. So that's the sort of the starting point of this process. So when they feel like they have to do something to compromise or to let economic to allow people to have some economic freedoms, and then, well, I mean, this might be somewhat too optimistical to the ears of some people, but it is very likely that when the regime it's like a slippery slope. When they start to initiate economic reforms and let economic freedom, let people enjoy economic liberties, then it is possible that, because the process will empower, on the one hand, the process will empower people, and on the other hand, it would also be more difficult for the government to change the status quo, because now it's more costly to go back to the past. So these two effects together might be able to bring, well, step by step, it's kind of a piecemeal process, might be able to bring more political freedoms to people. So this kind of, I'm just trying to paint a pragmatic picture for Cuban people, even though some people might not be happy with that.
I could not disagree more. I would remind my Taiwanese colleagues of what happened before Deng Xiaoping. If there had been not Deng Xiaoping, there would not have been a change in China. We would still be under the Cultural Revolution, we would still under the Gang of Four. We will not have had any change in China if it were not for the fact that there was a major change in the political process and the direction of the political process in China. When Deng Xiaoping said, look towards the east, look towards the eastern dragons, that's the future. It doesn't matter if a mouse catches the color of the mouse as long as it catches mice. So I think it has to be first political reform and then economic reform.
Let me I have a ton of other questions, so I'm going to try to keep it.
It's a very important question.
I have a question of in Taiwan, private banking. The private banking system exists in Taiwan. How is the banking regulated in Taiwan? Question. Private investments. How safe is the banking industry in Taiwan?
Okay, I think this is as safe as in any free countries in terms of the banking system in Taiwan. And actually, we have a pretty sound banking system. So we have a bank reform in the early 1990s. Okay, and just about the same as what have in Taiwan is that more importantly is that why we have a sound banking system is that we did not have a foreign debt. Okay, we are sufficient with our domestic savings. Therefore, we don't rely on the foreign debts. So the banking system, if the banking system rely on a lot of foreign debts, and that's what happened in the crisis of financial crisis in 1997 in most of the Asian economies. Okay, because of the high foreign debts. But in Taiwan, that's why it never happens, the kind of crisis in Taiwan, either in the financial crisis, 1997, or the 2008 global financial crisis, because we actually heavily relied on our domestic fundings, on our own financial systems.
Private ownership of banks?
Yeah, sure. Yes, we have private ownership, but of course we also have state-owned banks. But now it's actually become smaller and smaller.
Let me take one more question here, and then I have to move to the right because I have a whole bunch of questions here.
Let me do this. I'm Gregory Chan. I'm a provost at St. Thomas University. Our university came from Cuba 50 years ago.
Yes.
At St. Thomas University.
I studied there, yeah.
So on behalf of the university, I want to say greetings to all the Arabs. At the same time, I think the theme is wonderful, Taiwan as a model. And I want to echo what Dr. Chong have mentioned. Maybe we don't discuss that here. There's one thing that, to my observation, is very important, as Dr. Chong has mentioned a little bit. Today, we discuss about political and economics, how that can be a model. But I think Taiwan is a model already that China actually has copied in the last 15 years. And I call it, I may be wrong, it's called investment in human capitalism. Investment in human capitalism. Think about this today. The new cabinet, I read from the newspaper, there are 37 members in the cabinet with the new government. 32 have PhDs. And look at these young ladies and gentlemen around here, they all have PhDs from Chicago, New Orleans, and all this stuff. But there's no distinction between who's rich, who's poor. I think in the 1970s, Taiwan have done one thing real great that I think that we all can model. China's modeling is not to select only a few, to let them be educated, the popular education, and send them to the West. Send them to the West. Where's the West? Germany, England, Austria, America. And how many return at that time? Probably not many. But now, look at it. Look at how these people talk. They talk in English as they talk in Taiwanese. How can we talk? That's one thing. Number two is I think they are very generous. That one thing I want to say this way. In the history of American aid, AID, how many countries in the world have received American aid, including France, including Germany? How grateful are they to Americans? Taiwan was not recognized at this very moment as a government by the American government. But how grateful they are to America, and that's how they're doing to all the world. In other words, I'm very appreciative to point out the model, as we talk about Taiwan as a model, not to Cuba, okay, is their generosity in sharing what they have been benefited in the past around the world. And they are one of the smallest, I call it, in my own prejudice, the smallest giants that's really helping the world to understand, especially China. Every China is doing now is a copycat of Taiwan. In terms of sending 17 million people to graduate in China. There's a model, including the exam, sending people to America. So I want to congratulate and thank you for the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. and sharing these experiences.
Thank you very much. What's the question over here? I'll come to you. No, let me go later, then I'll come to you. Let's keep it brief, please.
Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, at least I'll speak for myself, I thought we were going to hear much more about the evolution of Taiwan to a democracy and not so much about economic success, which is great, economic growth in a totalitarian system up to 1987. Raul Castro missed a great lecture. The China model is the Taiwan model, obviously. And I hope that ICAS organizes another workshop to talk about the democratization of Taiwan and not how to make it grow, which is what the reforms in Cuba are all about now. How to make it grow, keeping the totalitarian model. I think that we have learned, I come out of here having learned incredible amounts of things that do help in the general picture. But we have not heard about at least I haven't heard, what I thought I was going to hear a little bit more about democratization in Taiwan. And we have heard about the great 30, 40 years of growth and economic development and opening China's markets, to Taiwan without questioning or without stepping on toes, human rights violations and everything else that we know, because the markets are necessary. I mean,
Okay. Let me continue with another question, then I'll open it up. Ma'am, yes, let's.
I have really brief questions for each of our participants, and that is, Dr. Tung, you did, by the way, I love the economics part of this program. You gave this wonderful summary about how Taiwan has managed to keep ahead of the development curve, and that was fascinating. And my question to you is, what next? The Japanese in the 1980s and the 1990s, as their economy was hollowing out, they kept saying, well, we can keep ahead of the technology curve, and they couldn't. So what is Taiwan doing to do that? Question for Dr. Zhuang relates to your question on your comment on the middle class. As the middle class grows in Cuba, we can expect pressure for democratization. The problem is, this hasn't happened in China. So apparently there's middle class development and middle class development. And what has happened in China is the middle class has developed under state capitalism, and in fact it supports these repressive policies. So perhaps Dr. Salazar Carrillo, you would have to talk with Dr. Zhuang about how you would develop a middle class in Cuba that would bring about these changes.
Okay, we have a couple of different questions.
I think she confuses two. I think she confuses us too.
Okay, that's
okay. Let's keep the answers brief, because we have a couple of other questions.
Actually, I want to respond to a very important question actually mentioned by several audience participants regarding about the economic reform and political reform, which one should be first, or they should simultaneously happen. I want to say one thing, okay? I know you are suffering too long, okay? Especially for Cuba. But I want to say that from the Taiwan's perspective and from what we have learned from Taiwan's experience, I want to say that political reform cannot be sustained without a good economic foundations and economic development. Okay, so even you have a political reform right away, if you do not have a good foundation for the economic development, then it won't help the economy. It won't help your people. It will be a chaotic situation forever. But economic reform can be sustained even under totalitarian regimes, just like Taiwan in the 60s and 70s. Okay, but I want to say, but the totalitarian regime system will be changed or collapse eventually as the economy developed from Taiwan's experience. So that's the short reply to what's the relation between these two and what Taiwan helps. And the other question regarding about middle class. Okay, middle class is very important for democracy. even under the totalitarian regime, okay, as we in Taiwan too, okay, they are a very important supporting period for the social stabilities, okay, and it also represents majority of the private sectors, okay. So once you have the development of private sectors, eventually the economic freedom will lead to political freedom, the cry for the political freedoms, and that, of course, will lead to the economic reform. Will lead to the political reform. Okay, that's my reply.
I guess I'm going to exercise a privilege here and sort of also comment on a couple of the topics.
Maybe just one sentence. Okay, maybe my suggestion for Cuba, okay, is that, of course, you can keep pushing from outside regarding about the changes needed for the Cuba, but most importantly is the internal change inside Cuba. And the internal change may be started from very beginning, from small pieces of economic changes. Okay, for example, we mentioned about the special economic zones, right? And if it started from small changes, that benefits not only private sectors, it also benefits the governments. If, for example, government can also increase their revenue, tax revenue from increasing in the income of the people. So if that process can benefit both people and the government, then that policy, is what I'm called market-friendly policy, will prevail, and that will help the economy in the long term.
That was more than one sentence, but that's okay. I want to disagree with my colleagues completely. 20-some years ago, we had no idea how a country should transition from a totalitarian regime on the political side and a centrally planned economy on the economic side towards free markets and democracy. Today, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have 32, 33 countries that we can look at as examples. If we look at those countries, one thing is clear. Those countries that very early on, a priori, made political reforms and hand-in-hand economic reforms today are both free and prosperous. Czech Republic, Poland, Estonia, Hungary. Those countries that said, let's begin by the economic reforms, and that democratic thing can wait, is some sort of an ornament, we'll do that at the end, we'll do that. Those countries have typically failed miserably. So I think the evidence is that political reforms should come beforehand, hand in hand. You have to empower human beings. It is not something that can be postponed as an ornament that you put at the end. So that would be my
correction started earlier with the Nazi economy being changed completely by Ludwig Erhard into a free market economy in the late 1940s. So the same thing happened in Japan with the American influence freeing the Japanese economy from the rule of the Keiretsu. And so it was even earlier that we had the experience that we could transform a centralized economy into a free market economy. The middle class in Cuba, the answer to that question. Agrarian reform, which doesn't mean non-participation from those people who were very successful in developing all the agriculture in Cuba before Castro. It has to be a combination of the people that have remained in Cuba and are there close to the land, but at the same time they don't have the knowledge, and they will be probably very helped by those who can come from Miami and help them to develop agricultural production in Cuba, which would strengthen the middle class in the agricultural sector in Cuba. Also, the industrial sector in Cuba will be export processing zones. Here I disagree, and I have to again remember my old esteemed professor, friend, brother, co-author, which I love dearly, which again I dedicate this whole thing to him Professor Antonio Jorge, who's passed away 4 or 5 days ago. I think we need to be an export-based economy, particularly at the beginning, and we should really be part of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, of the North American Free Trade Area. We have to, as soon as possible, become part of that North American Free Trade Area. It would be the 4th country would participate there after, obviously, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So I think that the middle class will be strengthened because we will be doing industrialization like Taiwan did it, with small industries. The secret of the success of Taiwan and the fact why the income distribution today in Taiwan, the Gini coefficient and the Lawrence curve in Taiwan is much more equal than in China. China has a very bad income distribution at this point. The mainland China, it's because it's really stressed small, medium, and small enterprises from the beginning. Outsourcing. The Taiwan model is one of outsourcing the economy. Having small enterprises or medium enterprises help the bigger ones. It was a model that created, therefore, a very equal income distribution as compared to others, because there's always, will never be an equality in income distribution, but at least a much more equal income distribution than what we have in Latin America, which is practically double the income distribution in terms of inequality than what they have in Taiwan. Today, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, all of these countries have a Gini coefficient which is almost twice the one that you have in Taiwan. So this is how we want to strengthen the middle class and have as much as possible an equitable income distribution in Cuba after this nightmare ends.
I believe we have time for maybe 2 more questions, young lady here, and Director.
Young lady is Olga Connor. I have noticed certain paradoxes here in the expositions. I would say that I would compare right now Miami more to Taiwan, because the Cubans in Miami have done what we would like to be doing in Cuba in the future. But it's also a situation in which a group of Cubans in Miami do not want to have any economic relations with Cuba because of communism. And yet, we have not talked about the fact that in Taiwan, there are 2 points of view also about relations with communist China and codependency economically. This part has not been discussed, and I think that it goes into the political activities within Taiwan, and I would like to have an opinion of the professors at the panel on this situation, because I think that in Cuba there is an anti-Americanism that has been fostering all of Latin American groups that are siding with Fidel Castro, and I wonder how that will affect the future as well, you know, supposing that we're comparing the 2 countries.
Okay, would anyone in particular like to answer that, or any?
You don't want to talk yourselves about the people from Taiwan, about how your economic policies and your political policies conflict?
Yeah, okay. I would like to say that ideally, okay, if you can have both economic reform and political reform happening at the same time, ideally, that would be good. Of course, that would be good. But technically, it's much more difficult to achieve. And that's why, from Taiwan's perspective, I just want to provide an alternative from Taiwan's perspective. Okay, you know, as I just mentioned this earlier, we start our economic reform 50 years ago. It was not until the late 1980s that we actually started the so-called democratization process. So it took us about 30 years before the actual movement in the so-called democratization process. Okay, so that's the Taiwan, that's the facts. Okay, so ideally I agreed that if you can implement both at the same time, congratulations. That that's a good thing to do. But however, it's very difficult because both two kinds of reform is very difficult to achieve at the same time. It requires a lot of works. Okay, and as I told you, Taiwan's experience actually provide a very smooth transitions. Okay, economically and politically, and that's my.
One more question from Director Mu, but I do want to acknowledge the visit of the Honorable Ileana Ross. Let him our guest.
It's not a question. I want to just add up just last points on behalf of my government, the Republic of China, Taiwan. We are not a communist country, never, and we will never become a communist country. The whole life, forever. That's a guarantee, that's a must. And we understand that in all given areas, different countries, its own pattern of development. We cannot impose one experience to another different experience, but we can learn from each other. So for Taiwan, we start from economic development, and we gradually make a very successful political reform. But in different areas, we know the priorities might be different, but we have to listen carefully for what people really need. So Taiwan, Republic of China, also, it's never been ruled by oligarchy, I should say. No matter in the past or now is a full democracy of Taiwan. So the parliament, the Congress, we have 113 seats representing the minority, Aboriginal, women, female, and social welfare groups. So now Taiwan is a full democracy. We listen to the people. Only people can decide what the government should do. The government cannot just say we want to do this and disregard the majority's opinion. And in the past, even though we don't have a full democracy before 1987 or even earlier, but at that time, Taiwan's policy-making process is not so-called only elites can decide it. Because in that surrounding, we deal with a 800-pound gorilla over the years. And so we have to compromise our priority, but we have to be careful to defend ourselves, national security, and stability, as the minister said earlier. So for that reason, Taiwan's decision-making process has to be carefully judged by the threat from the other side at that time. And also we have to cooperate closely with our ally countries, especially the United States of America. So this never change. We'll keep this momentum and we'll educate our next generation the value, the core value of democracy, of peace, and for liberty. So this is something I will use my life to guard. And I'm sure Congresswoman and all your friends here will guard your right for your future, for the next generation.
Amen.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank the panelists in this panel and the moderators and the earlier panel. They've done a great job. We will hear from Congresswoman Ileana Ross Lathan right after lunch, but I want to announce that the proceeding of this conference will be published both in English and Spanish, and the Spanish version will be sent to Cuba. It is important that the Cubans understand it. Okay, lunch is served, so help yourself, please.